For years, the Middle East stood at the center of global strategy, a region where alliances were meticulously built, maintained, and defended. To Washington, the region represented one of the most important pillars of its foreign policy, a place where influence was not merely exercised, but woven into the fabric of political reality. For decades, American presidents, diplomats, and military leaders believed they had achieved something rare, a network of partnerships strong enough to endure shifting politics, leadership changes, and geopolitical storms. But over time, cracks began forming in the foundation of this delicate structure. At first, the signs were subtle: a delayed meeting here, an ambiguous statement there, a diplomatic message that once would have been clear, now suddenly phrased in careful, cautious language. Agreements that previously took hours to approve now stretched into weeks, and then into months. Washington's influence, once unquestioned, began encountering a new kind of hesitation, a kind of strategic pause from leaders who used to accept its guidance without objection. While you are here, click of the subscribe button, like and share so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Inside the US State Department, analysts quietly started flagging unusual patterns. They noticed that key Middle Eastern partners were entering into new trade deals that didn't require American oversight. Others were modernizing their militaries with foreign technology rather than relying on US systems. Some were deepening cooperation with global competitors who were offering alternative pathways, cheaper contracts, fewer political conditions, and promises of equal partnership instead of hierarchical influence. Still, Washington didn't panic. Not yet. For years, it had watched temporary tensions rise and fall in the region like waves. There had always been disagreements, moments of frustration, periods where partners pursued their own interests before eventually aligning again with American policy. This time, however, something was different. The shifts were deeper, quieter, and more cumulative. A slow drift, not a sudden rupture, but one Washington failed to recognize before it became irreversible. The turning point came during a high-profile regional summit, one Washington had expected to guide discreetly through back channels. For weeks, diplomats prepared talking points, agenda proposals, and carefully worded statements. But when the summit began, something unexpected unfolded. Instead of reaffirming the traditional alliance structure centered around US influence, key leaders announced a bold and unprecedented plan. A new regional framework, economic, political, and security-based, explicitly crafted without American involvement. There were audible gasps in the room. Delegations exchanged stunned looks. This was not a minor adjustment or a simple diplomatic rephrasing. It was a declaration of independence delivered on the world stage, and it sent shockwaves through Washington. If you are here, click on the subscribe button, like and share so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. In the hours that followed, US officials scrambled to interpret what had happened. Was this a temporary protest, a miscommunication, a bluff, or was it something far more substantial? Within days, the answer became clear. The participating nations doubled down, holding follow-up meetings, signing new memorandums, and issuing a series of joint declarations emphasizing self-reliance and regional autonomy. What Washington had built over years, even decades, was being reimagined in a matter of weeks. From Riyadh to Cairo, from Abu Dhabi to Ankara, from Doha to Amman, leaders began speaking in a new vocabulary. They talked about regional identity, shared interests, collective security, and economic independence. They emphasized the need for a Middle East defined by Middle Eastern decisions, not foreign calculations, and they insisted that the time had come to rewrite the rules. In many ways, the collapse of the old US-led alliance structure wasn't caused by one dramatic event. It was the result of years of shifting realities. The global economy was changing. Technology was changing. Energy markets were changing. New diplomatic players were emerging on the world stage, and Washington, consumed by other geopolitical priorities, had failed to adjust its approach. Foreign powers recognized the moment. They moved quickly, offering what the region wanted most: respect, investment, technology, and partnerships that felt genuinely reciprocal. They did not impose political conditions. They did not demand alignment with ideological objectives. They offered cooperation on energy, trade, infrastructure, security, and digital transformation. The response from the region was immediate and enthusiastic. New energy agreements were signed that bypassed traditional American-controlled corridors. Massive infrastructure projects were launched with foreign funding. Technology partnerships appeared overnight: satellite networks, artificial intelligence research centers, cybersecurity initiatives, and advanced manufacturing hubs. Military academies began cooperating with non-Western advisors. Intelligence sharing networks were rebuilt around new participants. One by one, pillars of the old Washington-led structure shifted into place under a new regional architecture. But the biggest shock came when two long-standing rivals, nations that had spent decades in cold hostility, publicly announced a historic bilateral agreement. For years, Washington had treated their rivalry as a strategic puzzle only the US could manage, a tension that required constant mediation and oversight. Yet here they were, forging a future together without American involvement, guided instead by new mediators from outside the Western sphere. This single development signaled a reordering of the region. If these two rivals no longer needed Washington to manage their relationship, then what other disputes could be resolved without American direction? What conflicts, once thought impossible to settle, could be transformed through this new diplomatic landscape? Washington's leverage, once powerful and unquestioned, began evaporating. For decades, the US had used military aid, intelligence cooperation, trade privileges, and diplomatic backing as mechanisms of influence. But as the region diversified its partnerships, these tools became less effective. Military aid was no longer the only option. Economies became less dependent on American markets. Diplomatic pressure lost its bite. Even intelligence channels, once open and deeply integrated, became increasingly compartmentalized. Inside Washington, frustration and confusion spread across various departments. High-level delegations were rushed to Middle Eastern capitals in a desperate attempt to salvage influence. They offered new incentives, new commitments, and assurances that the US remained deeply invested in the region. But the responses they received were polite, measured, and non-committal. Leaders listened, nodded, and expressed appreciation, but no longer treated American proposals as the default path forward. The truth was clear: even if difficult for Washington to admit, the region had outgrown its dependency. But what made this moment even more profound was the nature of the new regional alliances forming. They were not strictly military or political. They were expansive, economic, cultural, technological, and strategic. They reflected the vision of leaders who had watched the world change rapidly and realized that the Middle East needed to define its own future rather than fit into predefined roles crafted by outside powers. Across Europe, Asia, and Africa, observers watched with intense interest. Some saw opportunity, new markets, new diplomatic openings, and a Middle East that could serve as a bridge across continents. Others saw danger, the destabilization of a familiar geopolitical system that, despite its flaws, had created a predictable framework for decades. Inside Washington, the debates were fierce. Some argued that this was a temporary shift, a phase that would eventually stabilize once the region realized the limitations of acting without American coordination. Others, however, warned that the shift was permanent, that the Middle East was now aligning itself within a multipolar world where Washington was simply one of many partners, not the anchor of the system. The most painful realization came when intelligence assessments revealed a dramatic truth. Many regional powers no longer believed that Washington could guarantee long-term stability in the region. The US had shifted its focus globally, prioritizing other strategic theaters, and in doing so, it had inadvertently created space for new competitive actors to gain ground. Actors who offered more attractive deals, stronger economic incentives, and fewer political strings. This was the slow-motion collapse no one in Washington had expected. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't involve declarations of hostility or diplomatic expulsions. It happened quietly, through choices made in boardrooms, palaces, ministries, and private strategic councils. Choices that reflected a changing world and a region tired of relying on external powers to dictate its destiny. Now, as this new Middle Eastern order takes shape, the consequences ripple far beyond the region. Trade routes are being redrawn. Global energy markets are recalibrating. Security frameworks, once centered around American bases, are evolving into regionally controlled networks. And global competition, economic, technological, and military, is accelerating. What comes next is uncertain. Will Washington attempt to rebuild its influence with new strategies? Will it accept its reduced role and shift toward cooperative multipolar engagement? Or will it face further strategic losses as other regions observe what happened in the Middle East and draw their own lessons? What is undeniable is that the old order is gone. The alliance that once defined US power in the Middle East has fractured beyond repair. And with it, Washington's final leverage has slipped away, not through conflict, but through evolution. A new Middle East is emerging, confident, interconnected, and determined to define its own future. And the world is watching.